Hello and welcome back to the From My Perspective podcast, where I, Jackson McCarty, tell you all the names you need to know in the college football landscape that could be changing the football landscape in the very near future. So today we're looking back on everything that happened in week 7 of college football, and believe me, a lot happened. We've got 10 different points that I want to focus on from last week, and before we jump into any of it, make sure you hit subscribe. It helps me out a ton, and I'm just trying to grow the channel. So the first thing I want to start with, everyone was talking about it, Tennessee was the place to be this weekend. Rocky Top became the national anthem for a day or two there. Tennessee knocked off Goliath. They beat Alabama. We've seen Alabama go to the brink multiple times this year, but Tennessee was finally the one that did it. And they had a lot of heroics, especially on the offensive side of the ball. You had Jalen Hyatt catching 5 touchdowns. You had Hendon Hooker really cementing himself as a Heisman contender, if not the favorite. But that ends up reminding me at the end of the game, I start looking at it, I'm like, wait a minute. They might be pretty similar to a team that not too long ago came through here and kind of was the true upset team, the true underdog, and went all the way to win the national championship. I'm talking about that 2019 LSU team that had Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson and Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Tennessee is beginning to remind me of that team. Are the similarities perfect? No, but you get to watch a former backup quarterback who transferred back down to the SEC and got his chance to start and really just took the ball and ran with it. 2 wide receivers, the Tennessee's being Brew McCoy, Jalen Hyatt. LSU's obviously being Jamar and Jettas. They're becoming too much for teams to handle at one time. Whenever you try to cover up Brew, Jalen Hyatt goes out there and gets 5 touchdowns on 6 receptions. Like, you're starting to see that duo really come together and prove how dominant they can be. And it's becoming just overall a very offensively innovative team that teams just can't really handle. LSU, a lot of what they prided themselves on was how good Joe Burrow could be on any given night. Hendon Hooker has absolutely taken that mantle and ran with it. We're seeing him take that late season push and really build up to what could end with him holding the Heisman Award. The key differences here is LSU's defense was a little bit better. I think they had more NFL talent on it as well. And they also used Clyde Edwards-Helaire more as a primary back, where Tennessee prefers that Jalen Wright and Jabari Small rotation. That said, LSU-Bama that year finished 46-41. They allowed over 30 points to Texas, Vandy, Ole Miss, and of course the Tide, like I just mentioned. That defense was not perfect by any means, and a lot of their strength was in their offense, something we've seen from Tennessee. Tennessee's been very good at stopping the run. The pass game, not so much, but they do at least have one half of their defense that's hitting on all cylinders. And by making this comparison, I'm not saying that Tennessee's going to go out here and win the Natty. I'm not even saying Hendon Hooker will 100% go and win the Heisman, but it's 2 teams in the SEC that have come out of nowhere to become truly disruptive and could be true underdogs going into the playoffs, fighting their way, to a top seed in the country, and eventually winning the whole thing. So, obviously to get there, you have to be one of 4 teams in the college football playoffs, the top 4 teams in the country. Soon enough, that will change. We're going to a 12-man system, and this year, and maybe it's an issue because of how wild this year has been, but I sat back and looked at it, and I'm not 100% sure that they're making the right move by only going to 12. And I know there's been a lot of pushback from different people, like especially through social media on, no, we should keep it at 4. It should be 8. It should be whatever. I think that, especially when you break it down into the numbers of it all, it's really fascinating how few teams get to go in college football and, why we're leaning into that whenever we've seen as many upsets as we have, and expanding the field could make for the playoffs being, 10 times better than what it currently is, or potentially what it will be whenever it hits 12 people. I wanted to look at 4 specific groups of athletics and what their playoff system is currently set up, and how many or what the percentage amount of teams is that goes to the playoffs. So with college football right now on 4, it is 3% of teams go to the college football playoffs. That goes to 9.6% when the expansion hits. 54 make it in college basketball. 54% of teams eligible make it to the tournament. Just shy of 44% make the NFL playoffs. playoffs. 2/3 make the NBA playoffs if you include the play-in, because that's 10 teams on both sides there that end up getting a chance to play postseason basketball. So I'm not arguing that they should invite 60 teams and turn the entirety of bowl season into a tournament and into a playoff. That's not at all what I want. But I do find it interesting that we have a ranking of 24 or 25 teams, but we're only going up to 12. I think that you could have gotten away with a 24 team playoff. And that way, you're giving a lot of these extra bowls that don't really have any credibility. They're now going into the playoffs and giving a little bit of credit to it, as to where, normally if you win that bowl, it's not really a good thing one way or the other. It's just kind of a resume booster. You give those some credit. We're getting upsets constantly. It's not like every top seed is going to win every year. We know that's not the case. We see it in the current college football playoffs. 3s win sometimes. I don't remember a 4 winning. That might just be me, not thinking very clearly at this moment in time. But, we see upsets every single week. You can call Utah an upset over USC this weekend. Tennessee absolutely was. And, even further down, Texas Tech's knocked off a couple good ones. Like Kansas was an underdog all the way through their season to this point, and then Oklahoma beat them, and I think you can consider them the underdog. Like, there's so much parity this year in college football, a lot of parity that maybe we're not used to having, but I think expanding the college football playoffs to even, maybe 24, like I said, could be a really cool thing to see and could truly provide some memorable moments and, really develop out that field. And we don't have that same song and dance every year. So the next thing I want to look at, somebody who, if we were on a 12 team, I still think would make it, Penn State. They lost to Michigan in a very, very convincing manner. The big thing here is I thought Michigan was a different team than they are. I thought Penn State was a different team than they are. And then I slowly began to realize during that game that I thought Penn State's team is what Michigan is. And I thought Michigan's team is what Penn State is. And I was wrong on it. They're completely flipped from where I believed them to be coming into that game. I predicted Penn State to win that game. That's not the case. And, Michigan could be like a legit contender this year, strictly off the back of their balance and especially coming from their offensive line. Michigan's ground game, again, their front five, that offensive line has been incredible. Their defense rebounded very well. After losing Ojabo and Dax Hill and Hayden Hutchinson and Josh Ross and all these guys last year, a lot of crucial pieces. Josh Ross not as much, but Dax Hill and those 2 edge rushers meant everything to that defense and was a big reason on why they beat Ohio State. That they've come back and they look, not as good, but they still look very, very good. Still one of the top defenses in the Big Ten right now. Harbaugh has figured it out as a coach. He's understanding what it takes to win, and he's finally got that roster where he wants it, and it's going to be a hard time, knocking them off of where they're currently at. Ohio State is the only team that I see with a chance of doing that. Of course, being able to use both Blake Corum and Edwards in the backfield is glorious. Edwards is a nice little added bonus. I would even call J.J. McCarthy a nice extra piece on top, the cherry on top, if you will, because a lot of times they don't just absolutely need him to take over. Eventually, he probably will need to, and then we'll really see what he's made from. But right now he is a luxury to a team that's very, very good in just about every other aspect of football. Penn State, they couldn't establish a run game with their freshmen. They couldn't, find any consistency, or, they had to rely too much on chunk plays. That's why they were only down, 2 or 3 going into halftime, because they had a wild pick six, and they had that huge run by Sean Clifford. They relied too heavily on everything coming at once, as opposed to truly establishing some form of rhythm. And again, James Franklin, he can't beat the big fish. We've seen it again and again and again. He can't get over the hump whenever he needs to, and despite the fact that I really don't see him getting fired because of how highly ranked his teams are going to be, especially whenever we move to the 12-team playoff. That's going to save his job a lot, I figure, because if he can get to 9 or 10 wins and, just lose to Ohio State and Michigan, he's going to be a playoff team. So it's really interesting because it looks more like an issue to Penn State than it actually is, or I guess it looks less like an issue because James Franklin is not cutting it where he's currently at. It's not working. Things are not functional how they need to be. And ultimately, it's putting them very far back behind the warning track, behind your Ohio States and Penn State or Michigan's. And this weekend proved that he's not on that level, and it's going to be interesting to see what Penn State tries to do moving forward, especially if they start losing coordinators like Manny Diaz, trying to get those new guys in the building. The next one I want to talk about was another ranked versus ranked matchup we've hit on the biggest three games we had this weekend. Oklahoma State and TCU. I still believe Oklahoma State's the better team, and I think that you could argue that this helps them going into Texas because they don't really have the confidence, and they've got to go out and retake it again because TCU did come in there and beat them. An absolute credit to TCU. Max Duggan looked good. Sonny Dykes has continued to rally this roster that is not his guys, and they've become a potential playoff contender at this point. You can't say that they're not because they're still undefeated and they've played some real tough teams, but if Spencer Sanders would have been healthy, I can't officially say that it would have been an Oklahoma State win, but you could tell that he wasn't quite himself out there, and he couldn't really find much of that stability or that rhythm that we've seen him have all year, and it came back to bite him. TCU was prepared to go into deeper waters on the day, and they did that. They took them to double overtime, and they came out with the victory, and it wasn't an explosion of offense stat-wise that I would have expected. Both Spencer Sanders and Max Duggan were kind of tame relative to what they've done for the rest of the year, but OT certainly boosted that final tally. Oklahoma State, again, kind of the same issue with Penn State earlier. They just couldn't find consistency, even though they got out to a huge lead early on. All the credit in the world to Sonny Dykes. I know I just mentioned it, but he has hit the ground sprinting, has the chance to go undefeated this year with a roster that is not his. It's going to be great for recruiting for him next year if they do manage to go undefeated or have one loss. Already to this point, it's great for recruiting, but there's certain tiers that he's just going to continue to climb as his record does. They just got to stay focused and not let those road game atmospheres mess with them because they do still have road trips against West Virginia, Texas, and Baylor. Of course, two of those are still in the same state, so maybe you don't get an overwhelmingly Baylor crowd whenever you're in Waco. Hopefully some of the TCU fans can travel down there. I don't think you really have much of a chance to put a dent in Texas's fan base, but we'll see with all that. And I think it could be better for Oklahoma State, again, going into that Texas game next week because we've seen them falter. They don't have that weight that's on them. That usually is why they fall. That weight potentially, might have crushed them going into this game. And they struggled. Now that monkey is off their back, so to speak, I think they really pick it up. And what would have been a prediction for Texas to win if Oklahoma State was still undefeated coming into this game has quickly become something that I believe I'll predict Oklahoma State to win this game despite them losing. I know that sounds backwards, but there's a certain level of pressure that we've seen Mike Gundy's Oklahoma State's teams struggle with, and I think that pressure is kind of dissipated now. So speaking of crushing, I think that coming into this week, I was so prepared for NC State to push Syracuse a little bit more without Devin Leary, and to be able to say that Clemson, just absolutely decimated Florida State, and that it was an easy prediction for Clemson to go out there and just destroy Syracuse. At this point, I don't feel comfortable, and I'm starting to get a little scared about Syracuse because I can't deny that they're a good team anymore. They have proven that they can go out there and hang in with some tough opponents. Granted, it's all been at home, and the student section is very much alive for Syracuse right now. But it's getting to the point where it's hard to just go out here and say, yeah, Syracuse is going to get, the floor mopped with them. That doesn't look like it's going to be the case. And Clemson hasn't really proven to be that type of team this year to just go out there and step all over their opponents. I wouldn't say Clemson had a close one with FSU. I think that score looked a lot closer than it actually was, but they definitely controlled the game after the half and really managed to have it their way, and a lot of what FSU did was in garbage time. They started compiling a lot of stats, but at the end of the day, you still haven't been beating teams by more than 10 points whenever it's a not really even comparable, but whenever it's a higher level of competition than your random games versus the Citadel or whoever they had in their non-conference play. Syracuse, not the best team in the country by any means, but they've got a lot of fight in them, and they've got a lot of momentum going in their way. It's one of those situations where it's hard to imagine that they'll get scared of the moment at this point, because they've got no reason to be just scared of the moment. Everything looks good in their direction, and they haven't had, they've had those years of losing and not being able to get over the hump. But now that they're finally getting some of that momentum and some of that strong play, they don't want to let go of it. It's not a fear thing. It's just we're going to fight to have this for as long as we can. Don't get me wrong. I figure Clemson is still going to win the game, but I believe the line is at like 13 and a half right now. I would take Syracuse to cover that. I would say Clemson's going to win by 7, probably. And we'll get into that more whenever I do my predictions on the next episode that I do. But it's not a crushing anymore, even though they are having to go to South Carolina to play that game. It should be a very interesting one way or the other. And Syracuse, I don't want to say that they've become underrated, but I think that they've become a real problem. Somebody I would say has become underrated, and perhaps the most underrated team in the country, is somebody who's playing that old school style of ball, that defense first and let the ground game carry you, and the quarterback just does what he needs to help you out. I'm talking about Illinois, who Brett Bielema has absolutely turned around in very quick fashion, and they have now, really risen to the top of college football, but, without much to say around them. Their style of play is not sexy. It is not what college football likes to see. It does not drive in ratings, but it is that old school style of football, fundamentals over flash. Illinois fully committed to those fundamentals, and they're now a real problem for just about any team in the country. The resume is not just the most loaded up by any means, but to hold FBS talent to, it's like 6 point something a game, maybe 9 point something a game. They don't allow very many points at all. To be able to go out there and do that on a weekly basis is impressive. It doesn't matter. Chase Brown, also the running back, he leads the FBS in rushing yards. He's the only one that's hit 1,000 already. He has been dynamite this year. He has been incredible to watch. And a lot of the attention goes to other guys like Blake Corum and Mo Ibrahim and guys like that. But Chase Brown, he's been a stud, and he leads the country in rush yards to this point for a reason, because he's very good on the ground. Illinois has the country's top-ranked defense in points allowed and yards allowed, and they're top 5 in turnovers forced. I don't care who's out there. If you're managing to stop people from moving the ball at all, and then whenever they do try to move the ball, you're forcing turnovers, you're doing something very, very right, and it doesn't matter who you're playing. It's going to transfer over because you're establishing a rhythm and consistency, and it really just shows a lot of chemistry across all 11 that are on the field. It really just comes down to the fact that they know what they are as a team. Other teams know what they are as a team, but you have to come out there and try to stop it, and that's not something that people have proven that they can do at this point. So Illinois has quickly become one of my favorite teams in college football, just for the pure fact that they're so underrated and they bring something different, a style of football that really hasn't worked in a really long time, at least to get to the upper echelon of football, and they're starting to make their way there. Granted, I don't know how long Bielema stays with the program, but that's not for me to worry about. Somebody who I believe also shouldn't really be worried about how this weekend unfolded is the Pac-12 as a whole, because I think that they sneakily won the weekend. And let me tell you why. Obviously, losing one of your undefeated teams, never a great thing, but Utah being the team that did it and what it took to beat USC on that game, it was just a full list of just incredible things after incredible things. I mean, look at it. Cam Rising had just about a Heisman performance that it required to knock them off. They beat them by 1 on the home field, and while they were honoring 2 players that had passed away, Ty Jordan and Aaron Lowe, it was such a motivational thing for Utah. They had so much that they needed to do to win this, back against the wall. Like, there was so much going on in that game that if USC would have won it, it's hard to imagine anybody in this country beating them. Like, it was just super impressive. And Utah, they're not a bad team by any means. They've lost a couple games that were quite unfortunate, more specifically that Florida game, but they're a strong team. They look good and they put the first dent in USC, which at the end of the day, I really don't know how big of a dent that'll be because when you look at it, the conference is just playing really well this year. Oregon and UCLA also, they had buys, so those records are protected right now. You don't have to worry about that. With everyone talking about the possibility that there could be three teams from the SEC in the Yoffs, the Pac 12 has plenty of resume boosting wins. Three one-loss teams, very dangerous Utah. Oregon State's not been bad. I still like Washington State, even though they have slowed down quite a bit there. I just think that a lot of what's happening out there on the West Coast is good for their conference, even if it did take a loss to USC to kind of show it. Something else I want to talk about conferences in specific. I want to talk about the Big 12, and more specifically, what happens with the Big 12 moving forward, because as we know, Oklahoma and Texas are almost out the door. They should be heading to the SEC either next year or the year after. I think that their football, and I'm not saying for financials or anything like that, but I'm just saying purely on a football level, they might become a way more fun conference when those two teams leave. And that's not because OU and Texas are beating up on everybody right now. The conference is already probably the most fun in football right now, but look at the teams that they're bringing in to replace those, and you'll understand why I'm saying it. You've got Cincy, who is currently, I think, 5-1. USC is the same. BYU has proven that they're a pretty good team. They're very offensive driven, which will fit like a glove into that conference. And then you're getting Houston, who's starting to bounce back a little bit. The season's not gone quite how you want it. That's definitely the outlier right now. Just relative to these other three teams, but they're starting to figure it out a little bit more. Two of their three losses are now to Kansas and Tulane. Tulane now ranked, Kansas was ranked, and, deservedly so. I just overall, their season has bumped up a little bit. And again, I don't think it's a team quality thing, but I think that they're adding four really fun teams to a really fun conference, and it gets me excited because at the end of the day, yeah, Texas and OU are way bigger brands than those other four, and that's just part of it. But I would rather have good football over big brands because I'm not the one financially gaining from that conference. So I'm super excited to see what happens with them moving forward. Somebody else I'm very excited to see what happens with moving forward is Mickey Joseph. He's continuing to go out there and fight for that Nebraska job to be the full-time head coach. And while, yes, they did just lose to Purdue, it's becoming very hard to tell him no, and to tell him no, he cannot hang around and become the next head coach, even if you have to replace your AD, even if you have to do all this, that, and the other. I get you can do bigger fish and you can catch a lot more attention with a different hire, but Mickey Joseph, it looks like he's ready to become a head coach in that position, and I'm very excited to see what they decide to do with him. The big thing here is that just the Cornhuskers continue to fight for Mickey Joseph. Yeah, they lost, but they showed a lot of resiliency and they fought till the very end, and they are fighting hard for Mickey Joseph. I'm worried that his tenure is going to be super similar to one in the NFL. Talking about Rich Bisaccia, whenever he stepped in the interim role versus Vegas, I thought he would have been a phenomenal hire to keep around there as well, but Vegas did not agree with me. They went out and got Josh McDaniels. How's that going for you? But, Bisaccia had to go back down to a coordinator's role, and now he's, I believe, in Green Bay, if I'm not mistaken. I don't see Mickey Joseph getting a head coach job that isn't Nebraska, strictly because, a lot of times interim coaches don't really get that look if the team that had them didn't give them that look. So it sucks to see, and I think that it would be great to see him take that position. I don't think it will happen, but at the end of the day, the harder he fights, the more realistic that becomes. And if they finish out this season on a high note, maybe there is some talks that they don't need to go get a big fish and that Mickey Joseph could just be their guy. The last point I want to talk about, and it's not really we've talked a little bit about the Tennessee game. It's tied in with that, but the SEC is such a weird beast this year. Usually it's the cream of the crop, and I think it still most likely is, but everybody feels like they're a little bit off from what we expected, and it's super fun to watch, but the conference definitely feels like it has more parity, but not in the way that they would have hoped for, I believe. Auburn still somewhat fighting. The team does not look like they dislike Brian Harsin, which is an interesting turnout, especially after watching what happened in the transfer portal. The guys who stuck around still seem to be on his side, and they continue to try to go toe to toe with a lot of good teams. Ole Miss is, if you told me that they beat a Georgia, I would be like, whoa, okay. But if they lost to, Vandy, I'd be like, oh, yeah. I mean, they're just one of those teams right now that I would believe any result you told me, because I still can't get a full grasp on what this team is. They have not lost yet this year. That much is certain. But it's so interesting because they've gone into deeper waters with teams that you would think are worse than them. And then they've done a lot better against teams that, like Kentucky, I thought Kentucky would handle that game. They did not. Ole Miss came out with the win there. They're a very curious team. LSU is weird. Florida, they're just about the same team at this point. They rely on a run first quarterback and don't seem like they have a whole lot else going on outside of that. And when that quarterback ain't working, they don't have much going on, period. And then obviously the Leach offense fell apart versus Kentucky. We had seen Mississippi State just passing the season with flying colors. That kind of stopped last week. Only scored 17, I believe. Georgia's about the only one you can feel good about across the board. And it may be a classic case of everybody beating up on one another and everybody, just these teams are better than they look like, but since they're going up against who they're going up against, whatever, that the typical argument for SEC fans. It feels very disorganized and chaotic, where usually you'd at least have some establishment of what the pecking order is at this point, and a lot of that is still to be determined. I think you know who your top three are. I think you know who number 4 is with Ole Miss, and then the rest of it, you're very just kind of like, I don't know. Is Arkansas good? Is Mississippi State, was that just a fluke? Is Kentucky still what we thought they were? Like, it's all very strange and doesn't really make any sense right now, which makes for a lot of fun in college football, but it doesn't make for the best argument that SEC is the be-all, end-all of football this year. Before we go, let's go ahead and take a look at my predictions recap from Week 7. I went 5-10 this week, so still can't break that 2-5-ish area, but let's go ahead and look at them. So the predictions I got right. I did say Tennessee was going to beat Bama. I said OU was going to run Kansas off the tracks a little bit more. That just means beat them and, keep taking a little bit of their momentum away. That happened. Utah hangs on to Pac-12 hopes. You could kind of sense everything going into that game. If they lost, it was going to be catastrophic. So that one felt kind of not like a layup to me because USC is a very good team, but you can definitely understand what the thought process was there. Clemson beating FSU fairly convincingly. The scoreboard does not reflect it, but again, garbage time. Did not look like a particularly close game until Clemson just kind of was like, took their foot off the pedal and was like, okay, we're going to win this regardless. Just do whatever. And then the final one of the unbeaten Sun Belt teams falls. Both of them fell. I thought that it was going to be Old Dominion versus Georgia Southern. That ended up being right, but Old Dominion beat Coastal. So, I ended up being right in this prediction way earlier than I expected because Coastal's game finished up earlier. But yeah, so that one was a little bit more broad, but I guess I got it right on both sides there, so I'm going to take it. On the wrong end of things, said Penn State was going to beat Michigan. Again, thought they were what the other team actually is. I said BYU would beat Arkansas because Arkansas secondary has been very bad this year, but they found a way to prevail in that one. Said Nebraska was going to beat Purdue and continue their hot streak. They fell in a relatively close fashion. Oklahoma State beating TCU. I thought Spencer Sanders would be a little bit more ready than that, and I think that if he would have been more ready than that, health-wise, I'm not putting that on him exactly, but I think they would have beat TCU. And then Baylor crushes West Virginia. The episode came out on Thursday, and then that Thursday night, West Virginia beat Baylor. So I just immediately started 0-1, which was a great time. But so we're going to continue to try to get closer to 6-10, 7-10, something like that as the weeks progress, because I've just been stuck in this position all year. But sometimes that's just how it goes. For now, that is episode 41 of the From My Perspective podcast, and as always, I'll see you next time.